Good morning, you beautiful Wake Up viewers. Thank you for being here. It's Friday, the 24th of October, 2025. I hope you are well. Welcome to Wake Up, the show that knows you can run, but you can't hide. And today's topic sums that up so well. Hello to you all in the chat. I hope you are well. I hope you are well indeed. Thank goodness it's Friday. So today I am reviewing in some detail the posthumous memoir of Virginia Roberts Giuffre, which was published this week. Its full title is Nobody's Girl, a memoir of surviving abuse and fighting for justice. I listened to the 13-hour plus audiobook, listened, took notes. It was exhausting, at times triggering to listen to, but it was compelling, and I want to convey that today. Our show today is not monetized. The details of this book are not advert appropriate, not if I want to be able to discuss the book without censoring myself unnecessarily. I do not intend to be gratuitous, but some of the details of Virginia's life, according to her, are indeed very graphic. So please also take that as a trigger warning if this is likely to trigger you. I'm not in a position here to be holding back. I want to be able to, as I say, convey as honestly as possible what is written and what is said in this book. This is an in-depth review into the thoughts of one of the most famous trafficking victims of the last few years. It's her memoir, her long anticipated book, and she's not here to be part of that, which is the first thing that triggered me. The proposition of seeing a woman's intimate secrets after her death was not a comfortable one for me, and certainly not someone who has worked as extensively as I have with survivors of child abuse. I have long covered Virginia Roberts Giuffre, and I'm in no doubt that she was indeed a victim of child abuse and of teenage trafficking. No doubt at all. Virginia very sadly died on the 25th of April this year, 2025. She was said to have taken her own life at her property in Australia. This book was published 6 months later. On April the 1st this year, Virginia sent the co-writer, Amy Wallace, and her publicist, Dinny von Mifflin, an email saying she wanted the book published even if she died. That's as far as we get to hearing about it. We don't know why it was not published while she was still alive. And it's one of a number of question marks that I was left with at the end of the book. We know that after she received a multi-million-dollar settlement to stop her suing Prince Andrew, she was gagged for a year not to say anything, so as not to spoil the Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations. Well, that accounts for 2022, but why wasn't Virginia's book released in 2023 or 2024? Why did her note to the co-writer and her PR sound as if she was up against challenges not to publish it at all? I've no idea. Certainly, and I don't want to be cynical, just truthful. But there are indeed less problems in releasing a book such as this when the author is no longer alive. You can't sue a dead person for defamation, although you could sue the publisher, which may explain why there is such a lack of names in this book. That said, there is a distinct shortage, as I say, of naming names anyway. We are given a description of people, and some of them, like Ehud Barak, the former Prime Minister of Israel, she has named in a lawsuit, but not in her book. I can only imagine that was a publishing decision. Either way, what we have here is a book of Virginia's life story as she wanted us to see it. That's what such books are about, a curated, sometimes poorly recollected version of events that people see fit to share with the world. Again, this is not for the faint-hearted. Some of her experiences will be triggering for those abused in childhood or abused at the hands of rich and powerful people who knew they could get away with it. She has catalogued her life chronologically, and so I will attempt to follow that with this review. Ultimately, I'm in no doubt whatsoever that this is a story about rich and poor, about privilege and neglect, about powerful and influential men and women in a trafficking cabal. They're bound together by their own weaknesses and by their compromise. They are bonded by their secrets and their lies. For Virginia, this book is a result of her metamorphosis, as she says, from abused child and trafficked girl to a mother, wife, and warrior. And the date of April the 1st, when she sent that email saying that she had to get that book out, is interesting to me, as it was the day after the press reported she had been involved in a car crash and had only days to live. This, of course, was the image that greeted the world at the end of March, beginning of April this year. And Virginia had posted that she had suffered kidney failure after her car collided with a school bus, stating doctors had given her 4 days to live and were transferring her to a specialist hospital. And in a statement shared with media, her spokesperson, Dinny von Mifflin, said Virginia has been in a serious accident and is receiving medical care in the hospital. She greatly appreciated the support and well wishes people are sending. Well, the parents of the children on the school bus were absolutely outraged. They said this didn't happen. This didn't happen the way that Virginia had portrayed it. And then it turned out that Virginia had not intended to publish that post. But nonetheless, it was quite clear that at that point that she was not being entirely honest about what had taken place. But with hindsight, this was clearly a warning that she was nearing the end of her tether with this world and how it had treated her. So the book, it opens in Paris. This is her when she was very young. But the book opens in Paris at the Louvre in 2020. Virginia had come to Paris, she said, to reclaim my life, to stand up to those who had hurt me. And let me bring up one when she was older. She talks affectionately about her husband, Robbie, right at the start of the book, and how he called her his little warrior. She was in Paris in 2020 to give a testimony against an abuser who had worked with Maxwell and Epstein, and she had the morning off and went to the Louvre to relax. When she was there, she had a panic attack. She recognized a room in it from when she was 17. It was a blood red room. It was dominated by a huge Louis XIV tapestry. She had been taken there by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell when they were trafficking her. Yet even though Epstein had been dead at that point for 2 years, he was still haunting her. Here she was, decades later, a 37-year-old mother and wife, and yet she could still recall the fear they instilled in her, even though Maxwell was awaiting trial at the time. And as I say, Jeffrey Epstein was dead. She was in France to confront Jean-Luc Brunel, a so-called model agent, but in reality, a trafficker of young girls, and some of them to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. At that point, Brunel was in custody awaiting trial on charges, including the trafficking of minors. He wanted to be bailed prior to trial, and Virginia had come to Paris to supply sworn testimony that he had repeatedly attacked her and should not be allowed out to await trial. He was dangerous, she said. Brunel was a friend and supplier of trafficked girls to Jeffrey Epstein and high society pimp Ghislaine Maxwell. For that is what she is. She's been portrayed in an assortment of ways. And the thing is, when you come from money, and certainly in a classist society such as England, if you talk with a clipped tone, you come from money and you are aligned with the establishment, people seem to think that you are more sophisticated, that you are perhaps more worldly wise, that you know more about the world. But in the reality, Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of a thief, was nothing more than a high society pimp. And Virginia had spent more than 2 years traveling the world with Epstein and Maxwell as a sex slave, as she describes herself, and being trafficked by them to other men. She said she had to believe that being in Paris would benefit her children. She had told them, "Mummy fights bad guys." Her kids' teachers thought that she was a cop because the kids had said to the teacher, "Mummy fights bad guys." So the teachers assumed she was a cop. Virginia thought that was funny. She said, "I'm not a cop and I'm not a saint either." After she'd visited the Louvre, she returned to her hotel to binge watch Law and Order while planning to return to the Louvre days later to face her demons again. And that is very much a theme in this book. She is someone who is prepared to endlessly and constantly confront and face off with anyone who has harmed her. That day in Paris, she gave an interview to NBC News. She said she felt able to, as Brunel no longer held power over her. Then she says she knows all about monsters. "I know about monsters," she said. "As a child, I suffered all kinds of abuse, incest, molestation." Virginia, I apologize in advance. If I accidentally say Victoria at any stage, it's a slip-up, and forgive me. Virginia Giuffre said she knew about being abused before she knew Maxwell and Epstein, but they had doubled down on her suffering. Just after her 19th birthday, she had met Robbie, her husband. She said her life since 2002 has not always been perfect, but she's grateful. She talks with such joy in the early pages of the book about having her 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. She said having children changed her, particularly her last child, her daughter. She didn't want her daughter to go through what she had. This is the intro, and it's an overview of what is to come in the book. She said she had begun asking deep questions about the abuse she had endured and wondered if there is something in our culture that enables child sex trafficking. It's something I wondered repeatedly myself. She said she wanted to change the trafficking system and get survivors justice and challenge the statutory times of reporting these predators. She notes that even though her story has been told many times, not once has it been told as fully as she intends to tell it in this book. She says children do not find themselves being trafficked by accident, but by failure of those around them. And I absolutely agree with her. At the end of this introduction, she again pays tribute to her husband, Robbie, and his reference that she is a warrior and with a story to tell. She tells her story in a chronological order, and so I'm going to follow it and take it chapter by chapter, because I think in order to understand that, it needs to be as in-depth as I can make it for Wake Up. So we will start with chapter 1. This is a massively traumatic way to open any book. She is a tear-stained girl sitting on a sidewalk in a parking lot. She's 15 years old. She has a blooded face, the taste of gunmetal still in her mouth, and a beautiful Cruella de Vil type car rolls up on her. That's how she describes it. Throughout this book, Virginia often escapes into a land of movies and Disney characters. I presume in part it's because of the early childhood abuse that she suffered, that she is also left with something of arrested development, which is quite common in survivors of child abuse. It's like their life stops when the abuse of them begins. So in this car that had rolled up on her as she's blooded and tasting gunmetal in her mouth was an older, balding man and a young, pretty female. They invite her into the car to be taken care of. Just a couple of hours before this, she had escaped from a detention type centre. She went to a shop to get out of the regulation kit, and she shoplifted a new outfit. Now she was sitting in the gutter, and a man in a big posh car was approaching her. She reflected, I've always been good at talking to strangers, but this was not any stranger. This was Ron Eppinger, a man who would later be convicted of trafficking Eastern European girls into the United States. And Eppinger could spot a vulnerable girl at 100 paces, and for whatever reason, his and Virginia's path crossed that day. He picked her up in his car. He promised to take care of her. You know, these predators, they smell vulnerability miles off. And she recalls how Eppinger took her shopping, buying her 2 short shorts and G-strings. Bear in mind, she was only 15, and holding up these 2 short shorts and these G-strings to her young body. Then his chauffeur drove them back to his home. She was introduced to 5 other girls. Most of them were naked or just wearing underwear. They barely could speak English. Then Eppinger took Virginia to sleep with him, and he called her baby. She accepts that this gave her a sense of comfort, I suppose, coming from the background that she came from, which she goes into in detail shortly. I can see why she would have found this comforting. It's a telling sign of the abuse and the degree of it that she had already suffered. How much worse, she thought, could it be than what I've already experienced? And she reflects on her time before that in foster care, with dealing with childhood abuse and being on the streets, and suddenly being in the bed with an elderly man and lots of naked young Eastern European women didn't seem that bad to her. It kind of gives you an idea of how bad things must already have been for her at the age of 15. And it's at this point again that her memories seem to overwhelm her, and she switches to an anecdote about getting her children ready for school and family fun at breakfast, which all seems kind of odd given what she's just been discussing. It's almost like the purity of her own children enables her to wash away the feeling of being dirty that often accompanies survivors of child abuse. Then she flicks back once again to the night that she met Ron Eppinger. It was in Palm Beach. She had escaped from Growing Together, this detention type facility that her mum had dumped her at. She'd hitchhiked out of town. She was walking for about 20 minutes when a man in his late 30s or so gave her a lift. He took her to a motel room. He overpowered her. He put a gun muzzle into her mouth. He raped her and choked her until she lost consciousness. This is at the start of the book. And I'm already thinking, dear God, I want to rescue her. And it's at that moment that I remember that she's no longer even here. At this point in her experience with being raped and with gun in her mouth, she imagines herself being dead. Then this guy, this is not Ron Eppinger, then this guy who had picked her up off the street before Ron Eppinger, his cell phone rings and he steps outside to take the call, and she ran. And that was how she found herself bloodied and with a taste of gunmetal in her mouth when Ron Eppinger happened upon her. It is a harrowing chapter. It is unfathomable for most to imagine that such a young girl could get into so many dangerous scrapes and have so much violence and exploitation visited on her in one short night. And she lets the viewers know that she didn't get here by chance, that a childhood of neglect and abuse brought her here. I was shaken, actually, after listening to the first chapter. I didn't know how much of this was precisely and exactly true. I have had my own experiences with Virginia when I didn't find her to be always entirely honest. So I worried about the details, but I was in no doubt, and I remain in no doubt, that the main parts of what she had recalled had almost certainly happened. I believed that the events were true, if not always accurately recalled. Memory is a funny thing. I believe absolutely that she was raped and that he put a gun into her mouth. I believe that happened. Then she moves on to chapter 2. And she talks about Growing Together, this weird facility that her mum had dumped her into at the age of 15. She was told to repeat that she was a whore, a slut, a druggie, and that was by counsellors. She said her mother tricked her into going to Growing Together, the name of this facility. They had arrived at this place, and suddenly she was surrounded by people with clipboards. She recalls seeing her mum and her fiery red hair walk away from her. Mum had declared that Virginia was out of control, defiant, and prone to emotional breakdowns, and she was taking all kinds of drugs by this point. She said her mum was absolutely right. These things were true. As a young teen, she was a rebellious mess. She just wished that her mum had bothered to ask why. Growing together, she said, was a fortress. She spent much of her time in the isolation room. She told counsellors about her mum's drinking and the violence that erupted when her mum was drunk. It terrified Virginia and her brothers, but it was Virginia who she focused her anger on. Virginia recalled her mother picking rose thorns from the garden and the trailing thorns, taking down Virginia's trousers in front of the neighbour and whipping her bare backside. At first, Virginia said she felt some relief to be talking to counsellors, but soon she came to understand why growing together became known as suffering together, as kids endured beatings and public humiliation, just as she had already experienced at the hands of her own mother. There was a complete failure in child safeguarding at Growing Together. They brought in millions from donations and fees, and it was eventually shut down after a damning media piece told the tale of what was taking place there. It sounded like a complete nightmare. She portrayed it as a Lord of the Flies type atmosphere. There was a lack of staff and the kids were policing each other. There was child on child abuse. They were involved in hazing rituals with each other. She vowed that the attacks would never happen to her. She recalled one staff member, the enforcer, who threw kids on the floor. She recalled the disgusting food. It was the same menu every week. Children were forced to obey, chew, and swallow every last unappetizing piece. She recalls vomiting when she tried to force food down. Staff would say, "What goes on at Growing Together stays at Growing Together." Alas, she wasn't able to protect herself. She recalls that period of time of her having to endure more sexual attacks, including several boys raping her in the back of a car. She was journaling all this. The staff could read it, but nothing was done about it. She concluded that no matter what happened to her, nobody cared. She ran away repeatedly and was always brought back. Even when she was put into foster homes, she would run away and then be returned to Growing Together. She even had a runaway name, Rachel, she called herself. At Growing Together, she recalls parents coming in for confessionals where they got to say what was wrong with their kids, but without any accountability for their role in it. She explains, "This is just some of what I had been through when I met Ron Eppinger. I had felt worthless for years. Maybe I was that whore. Maybe I was that slut. Maybe I was that druggie, like the counsellor said I was, but I hadn't always been that way. Once I had been a daughter, a sister, and a beloved little girl." And as you can hear, I feel quite emotional reading this because a lot of it is emotional. Actually, it is. She said that remembering a better time may have been the only thing that kept her from giving up. And chapter 3 is where she talks about being born and given the name Virginia Lee. And it opens with her father's eldest brother and horses and how she was riding bareback from the age of 3. At this point, she has fonder recollections of her dad and mum, Sky Senior and Lynn. Lynn's mum, Shelley, was one of the first female tennis pros in the country. And Lynn had also been abandoned by her own mum. Her mum had married husband number 3, a tennis player called Bucky Walters Jr. They moved back to Palm Beach. They joined the tennis club and eventually sent for Lynn for her daughters to join her in a new life, Lynn being Virginia's mum. Virginia's mum rebelled and ran away and was a mum at 16. There was a pattern already being formed. She met Sky Roberts, her second husband, who took in her son Danny. They married in December 1982. And 8 months later, Virginia Lee Roberts, who everyone called Jenna, was born. Jenna recalled visiting her grandmother Shelley in Palm Beach. They were not allowed to call her grandma. Virginia said she didn't have a nurturing bone in her whole body, although she did admire how Shelley lived life on her own terms. Virginia's parents at this point found a 3-bedroom ranch house on a dirt road in Loxahatchee, about half hour away from Palm Beach. This period was clearly the heavenly period for the family as they settled into their new home with new security. Virginia was a tomboy. She spent plenty of time on the land with the animals and wildlife and climbing trees. She wanted to be a vet. The family had dogs, goats, chickens, but there were signs already that all was not well. When Virginia's baby brother, Sky Jr., was born, her parents put his crib in with her in her room, and it was Virginia who comforted her baby brother when he woke up at night. She felt like his mum when she was still a baby herself. She started elementary school. Mum wanted her to be more feminine. She recalls her teacher recommending Charlotte's Web. On nights when her parents were drunk and she had to put Sky Jr. to bed, she read Charlotte's Web for comfort. She was escaping already. By now, her mother was showing a more sexist side, and she insisted that Virginia do housework that her brothers didn't have to. Ironically, Virginia said that her own mum was not a good housekeeper. Inside the house looked like a tornado had been through it, but that is often the consequences when you have drunk parents. She envied children who had money for school lunch, and she remembers her unappetizing and musty smelling packed lunches. The family had no spare money. Whatever money they had, Dad spent on cars and beer, and a good school lunch was out of the question. But then her dad did really weird things, like one day he bought Virginia a horse called Alice, and he told her, "She's all yours." She said, "With Alice, I felt completely safe," although she hadn't yet experienced reasons to feel truly scared, but she would. By this point, we're at chapter 4. It's entitled Less Than Nothing. And this chapter is the point when it signals a great deal of change and trouble entering her life. As I said, baby Sky had stopped sleeping in her room and she was left alone. At the same time, her mum stopped running her bath, stopped washing her hair, and stopped getting her into PJs. And her dad, Sky Sr., took over. She said, "I love my dad. He taught me to ride Alice. I trusted him." Then, during bath time one night, her dad commanded her to stand up to make sure that she was completely clean. She was uncomfortable. She was only about 6 and she wanted Mum to come in, but Dad said no. He had a washcloth in his hands and soaped her all over, including between her legs, which she said he stayed too long doing. That night, her dad touched her in ways she said nobody had before. He told her she was his special girl and that this was his way of giving her extra love. He used his fingers and his mouth on her, but the details are too graphic for me to say here. In no time at all, he was forcing her to play with his genitals. One day, she announced, "I don't want to do bedtime stories anymore. I don't want the bath time ritual." She was a child and she was confused, but she knew that what was happening felt wrong to her. Her father, I should say, has denied ever abusing her, but I am working from her memoir, and in this, he most certainly did, and extensively so. So the bedtime ritual ended, but the abuse didn't. Her father began coming to her room in the middle of the night. She recalls the door opening and the light shaft coming in from the hallway. Then she claims her dad will get into bed, fondling her and forcing himself on her. It's triggering to hear. I felt both nausea and anger on hearing it. At this time, her mum became more hostile towards her, telling her she wondered if Virginia was actually her daughter and whether she actually had been switched at birth in a mistake. Her mother questioned whether Virginia was a mistake to the family. Virginia couldn't understand why her mum had turned against her, why her mum was so mad at her. Did her mum know her father was molesting her? Was she, in her warped and drunken mind, jealous of the attention Virginia was receiving from her father? If that was the case, she wouldn't be the first woman to act like that. We've heard stories like that before where women are complicit and then they turn on the child. Virginia suspects her mum did know. She recalls hearing her bedroom door opening one night when her dad was molesting her. It was her mum. Then the door closed as if the person did not want to see or acknowledge what was happening to the small child inside the room. At this point, Virginia was getting urinary tract infections. She went to the doctor. The doctor was confused. The doctor said she has a broken hymen. Her mum was quick, said, oh, she rides horses. Virginia was also wetting herself, and her mum flew into rages when she found pee-soaked clothes and wet bedding and would beat her daughter for doing this. Then Virginia's older brother Danny was sent away to school, and now, according to Virginia, her dad was also molesting her in the day. Not unusually for an abused child, she suffered deeply complex emotions. She remembered watching movies with her father afterwards, after the abuse in the afternoons. She recalls bargaining with herself to get the icky stuff with him over and done with, and then life can be good again. When she was around 7, she was introduced to a landscaper friend of her dad's called Forrest and his stepdaughter Sheila. Sheila was 16. Virginia recalls her mum, her dad, Forrest, and his wife sitting outside, drinking beer and laughing, and the parents joked about trading girls to each other. Virginia, in writing the book, had corresponded with Sheila when they were both adults, and Sheila, the stepdaughter, confirmed that night on the porch when their parents were drinking beer together. Sheila said that she was never traded to Virginia's dad, but had later filed against her own stepfather and got a restraining order against him for molesting her. Sheila said they were not the only girls that Forrest had abused. He'd been previously convicted and imprisoned. Nonetheless, Sheila's mum, as is often the way, stood by her husband until 2010, when she found images on his computer and finally threw him out. Virginia can't remember the exact date that she was first given over to Forrest for him to abuse. She recalls being in a bath and Forrest walking in and insisting on washing her good and proper, just like her dad had done before. She recalls being molested as he narrated his actions out loud. He told her, "Touch my muscles, tell me how big they are." She remembers him laying on top of her small body, crushing her. It was at this point that she switches again in her book to something that makes her happy. She said her experience taught her to rely on music to make sense of her life. She reminisces about driving her children to school while listening to music. She says listening to Tracy Chapman singing "Give Me One Reason" helped her to start processing in the 1990s what was happening to her. The information in the book, by the way, about her father is a new revelation. She has only previously said that a family friend had abused her as a child. Again, this doesn't mean she's making it up. It is not uncommon for survivors of child abuse, particularly at the hands of their own parents, to deny that it, or just not acknowledge that it happened and then put it onto somebody else. Oh, somebody else did it, somebody who was close to the family. That is very common, but it is nonetheless a new revelation. And as I say, her father has denied ever abusing her. And she acknowledges that even though she became a public figure, that she just couldn't bring herself to relay what had happened between her and her father, or really about Forrest abusing her. She didn't ever publicly say their names until this book. But according to Virginia, they both raped her. Sometimes they liked to spend time together with her. They took her, a small child, to see arachnophobia, about spiders. She was terrified of spiders ever since. And her mum is clearly a source of great pain to her. She said she was failed by her mum. Let me just do that. She said she was failed by her mum, who even suggested that Virginia was trying to steal her husband from her. But as Virginia notes, she never bothered to find out why this grade A student was suddenly failing. And again, it's here that you get another sense of the complex emotions that often accompany child sexual abuse. Virginia talks about clinging to affection from her father. Abused children do this. This is not uncommon. And she noted that she felt good when he touched her, even though it disgusted her. She felt loved. She felt special. It was incredibly confusing to her because the rest of the time she was being neglected. Her dad said, "You're my star, and and the things I do with you, I don't even do to your mother." He essentially, in her words, made her like his partner. By this point, and she was still under the age of 10, she quite naturally began experimenting with young boys. Now, I say quite naturally because at this point, according to her, she had already been significantly sexualized. So sexual experimentation came early to her. Again, she returns to relaying her childhood like a children's tale. She talks about Charlotte's Web and how it gave her strength. She said that she felt less than nothing and she longed to feel something again. And by this point, I was like, I didn't know her at all. I don't think anybody did, if this account is accurate. At 9, she was invited to her first sleepover and immediately she regretted it. Her experiences so far had made her unlike any other children, and she didn't bond at the sleepover. And so she actually left the house. She went out into the garden. It was a farm, and she headed for a barn. She found herself face to face with the horse that lived there, but it was having trouble moving. Like her, it was neglected. It was captive, and in her words, left to drown in its own excrement. She marched into the kitchen. She rang her mum and demanded she bring their trailer. She squared off with the host parents and said that she was taking the horse. And she took the horse. She said it was a rare moment of feeling pride for herself and her mum, but it left her confused. Why was her mum prepared to fight for an abused animal, but her mum was not prepared to fight for her own daughter? At this time, Virginia found solace in her neighbor, Ruth. Ruth ran a therapeutic riding center for disabled children. Virginia was 10 years old. She drew so much from spending time with Ruth. Suddenly she was with an adult who actually appeared to care about her and about other children who were struggling. But it was around this time that she began to hate herself. She began to hate her body. And she sought solace by watching Cinderella. Again, more escapism. She was an unloved daughter doing chores and being mistreated by her family. She dreamt one day of a prince rescuing her. Chapter 6 is entitled If Wishes Were Horses. This was a difficult time for her. Again, her periods had started. She was a skinny wreck. She was sent 3,000 miles to Aunt Carole, her mother's sister. She wondered maybe her mother was protecting her from her father, seeing as her periods had now started. But it felt like once again her mother had chosen her father over her. She said her father was a racist. She said he told his children that Black people were born with tails that had to be cut off at birth. She found herself in a school where there was only a handful of white people, and it was predominantly Hispanic and Black. She stood out like the proverbial sore thumb. She was an outsider in more ways than one, but she had her hair shaved off and they left her alone. She looked more thuggish, as if she was slightly insane and would take on anybody. One night, she climbed out of Aunt Carole's window. She hitchhiked 100 miles north to San Francisco. She was unprepared and cold, and then the cops arrested her for begging. Meanwhile, Aunt Carole had had enough. She told Virginia's dad that they needed to take her home, and they did. They came, they picked her up, and then Virginia was taken home, and that was when she discovered that they had sold Alice her horse. The one thing that she had to lean on. And again, I find myself relating really strongly to her because I was an abused child and I had a dog. And I think that what she put into Alice the horse was probably similar to what I also put into my dog Honey, my confidant. And I think it was similar. Now, this is where it got interesting for her because she didn't know why, but she went back home. And at this point, the sexual abuse stopped. Forrest had gone and her dad was now leaving her alone. Then she recalls a family camping trip with her dad, her mum, and her siblings. They went to Sacramento for a family gathering and for camping. Enya was now Virginia's escape, and she put on headphones and she sang Sail Away to herself repeatedly. On the campsite, she met a young lad who walked her back to her tent. Her dad arrived in a car. He was furious. "What the are you doing?" he said. "You're a effing slut." He threw her into the van. That night, she finally snapped. In front of her relatives, she screamed at him. "What, you think you're the only one who is allowed to touch me?" She yelled at her dad in front of her relatives, and so her mum would get wind of it. Then she told them, "This guy has been me for years and no one has done anything about it." She wished they would protect her. That's why she was that blunt. But they did nothing. Then her dad beat her up and no one did a thing. Her little brother Sky tried to help, but her father blocked him and carried on beating her up. She hoped the next day that something would be done. Her black and blue body made it down to breakfast, but all anybody was interested in was, "Do you want some bacon and eggs?" Everyone acted like nothing had happened. They ignored the bruised elephant in the room and everything she had said the night before. Nobody did a thing. And then her family got in their camper. They drove back home to Loxahatchee as if everything was normal. Now, if this even has a morsel of truth to it, what a betrayal. What a betrayal. You've even gone so far as to scream to other adults what is happening to you. You are beaten up by your father and nobody does a thing. Not a thing. And I kept thinking at this point, this girl was ripe to meet people like Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Again, predators know what they're looking for and vulnerability is their gig. And she started middle school when she was 13. She stopped fighting. She had lived on the streets and she was happy to be back home again, even amongst all of this. Then Forrest, her abuser, her dad's mate, reappeared. Now, apparently, he was a man of God, and she was instructed by her father to hear him out. Forrest grabbed her and forced her to her knees like he had so many times before. Then he said she needed to ask God for forgiveness for what she had done with him and her dad. Predators always blame victims. It's not unusual. It's what they do, sometimes to ease their own guilt and their own conscience. It was at that point, of course, that she knew she hated Forrest. She knew she hated her parents. Every living being in Loxahatchee. She said her rage was at boiling point. She ran away repeatedly. She skipped school. She smoked pot. And she only regularly attended English class because she liked writing and reading. She sought out older kids. She sought out the bad kids. She got high. Anything to escape what she was dealing with. And it's at this point she realizes that the reader may feel somewhat overwhelmed with the detail of trauma she says she had endured. "I know it's a lot to take in," she says. "It plays like a trauma wheel in my life. but put this book down if it's too much. But please come back to it. This is how I have got through it, she said, by focusing on the present. Then she's back to dinner time in the Giuffre household, and Robbie is cooking dinner, his famous shepherd's pie, and the kids are running to the table. And she talks about her husband with such great affection at this point that it's hard to imagine that he would later be convicted of violence against her. She says Robbie may not be an educated man, but he has taught her and the children so much. Our kids know something that I didn't as a child, she says, and that is their father will do anything to keep them safe, and that allows them to thrive. She said, my husband is difficult to ignore, but he gets children out of a funk. When we lash out or get angry, he's no stranger to anger himself, but it is Robbie who pushes us to find what the underlying hurt is. She also says if Robbie couldn't get through to them, he would drop his pants and moon them. That's my husband, she says. Well, to me, her husband sounds weird and inappropriate, but she portrays it as just one of those things. I'm not quite sure how many fathers use mooning their children with bare backsides to discipline them, but that's what she said her husband did. Weird. And you know what? From her background, it probably didn't feel weird at all. It probably felt like affection, like humor. I'm not suggesting her husband was abusing the children. I'm just saying that act on its own is weird to me. It's weird to me. And then as swiftly as before, she's back to describing her young life and how she started to drift from one guy to another, staying at homes and then moving on. She was only 14 and barely sleeping at her parents' house by this point. And this was when her mum tricked her into entering the Growing Together facility. And it's at this point where she reflects once again what brought her to the Eastern European slave trafficker, Ron Eppinger. She notes he made an exception with her by picking up an American girl. And when she was with him and around this time, she began to take Xanax and oxycodone just to numb the pain, as one might, frankly. But not everyone saw it this way. And Virginia at this point starts to address her haters, her critics, and reflects on the take, for example, that from a reporter who portrayed her as a young woman who loved the lifestyle of the rich and famous rather than being a victim of it. Virginia says, my wishes were horses. The horses outside my window embodied the freedom I lacked and wished for, and they gave me hope that my life may someday get better. And again, very emotional stuff. I mean, really emotional stuff. And you know, I'm not sure how much was co-written with Amy Wallace, but I can hear Virginia's voice a lot in this book. So I'm in no doubt whatsoever that it is her book, and it is her voice that is coming through. By the time we get to chapter 7, she opens with Ron Eppinger giving her away after 6 months. She literally describes it like that. She said, yes, he gave me away to a middle-aged man. Then one night, the FBI agents bust into this other middle-aged man's apartment and rescued her, took her to the police station, grilled her about what they had done to her, and then they called her dad. He came to the station for her. She was 15 at this point. She said, there was no joy in me. Her dad spat at her that she was a slut, and then he started to cry. And then dad took her back to Growing Together, and then she ran away, and then she called her parents. It was a cycle. Dad blamed mum for her being there. Dad came to pick her up. Mum was not at home on one occasion when she returned, but she found her smoking and drinking beer on the porch. And then her mum stood up, slapped her, and they were both crying. Very complex family dynamics going on here. Don't forget, Virginia's mum herself had been abandoned by her own mum. And she doesn't go into any great detail about what had happened to her father. But again, it's highly possible that her father was abused as well. That's no justification, what happened to Virginia, by the way. I do not justify abuse, even when it's at the hands of somebody who's been abused. And the most comfort she derives in these early days of her life is from her little brother, Sky, who she affectionately refers to as Sky T. Neither mum or dad wanted her at home, so she stayed with an assortment of friends. Her friend's stepbrother offered to be her roommate. She said yes, even though she worried he wanted more. But by this point, she kind of didn't care if men did, boys did. She was so used to it. His name was Michael. She started sleeping with him. She didn't love him and didn't know how to set boundaries. And he proposed to her when she turned 16. Again, Virginia turns to music as her savior to escape from this life that she's living. She recalls the lyrics from Richard Ashcroft and the Verve, Bitter Sweet Symphony. She sings, "I need to hear some sounds that recognize the pain in me." At this point, she's so uncertain what to do with her life. So she started working in a pet shop. She was a high school dropout. She was living with a boyfriend she didn't want to and parents who didn't want her. And it was the summer of 2000 that everything changed and put her on another path. And this is really key. Absolutely key. Her dad was then a maintenance man at Trump's Palm Beach Mar-A-Lago club. He got her a job as a $9 an hour locker room attendant. She recalls walking onto the shimmering manicured lawns the first morning. She watched an army of gardeners and it soothed her. Her dad was responsible for air conditioning and tennis courts at the club. She was put through a drug test and a polygraph, and the hiring manager agreed to take her on. That's quite a lot to put somebody through for a job as a locker attendant, but then bear in mind the place was owned by Donald Trump. She was given a white polo shirt emblazoned with the Mar-a-Lago crest, a short white skirt, and her name tag said Jenna, the name her family gave to her. There was a 65-page document which set out rules of etiquette. She said it was odd. She felt safe with the rules, at last some boundaries in her life. She'd only been there a few days, and her dad took her to Trump's office. "This is my daughter," he said. She said Trump couldn't have been friendlier to her. He asked her if she liked kids and if she was interested in babysitting. That seems to be the sum total of her recollection in meeting Donald Trump. The spa she worked in was gilded and sparkling. It smelled delicious. The baths looked like something an ancient Greek god would soak in. She questioned the massage therapists about how to massage. She felt more hopeful for her future. She hoped this was the opportunity she needed to put her past behind her. And then one day she recalled being at Mar-a-Lago and a car slowing down behind her. Unknown to her, in the car was Ghislaine Maxwell and her driver. The driver later testified that on this day, Maxwell saw Virginia and commanded him to stop. And Maxwell got out and she followed Virginia. On reflection, Virginia said she wished I saw through her polished facade, but my first impression was I'd be lucky if I could grow up to be anything like her. Now, even though Ghislaine Maxwell was a predator, she was also a highly polished English society girl who grew up around establishment people. And that would have been impressive to a young, neglected American girl like Virginia. Maxwell approached Virginia while Virginia was reading a book on massage. She was on her break at Mar-a-Lago. She tells Virginia that she has a friend, a rich and clever mathematician who knows how to make lots of money, and she's looking for a massage therapist. Virginia is reluctant. She's not trained, but Ghislaine reassures her that's not necessary. Then she invites Virginia to meet the rich man. Virginia's dad drives her to Epstein's mansion that evening. Virginia said it was a garish pink color, even though it was painted white before it was demolished and after all the revelations came out. Maxwell took her into a bedroom and then into another room where the 47-year-old at the time, naked Jeffrey Epstein lay face down. Virginia was faced with a nude backside and confused as to what to do. She sought reassurance from Ghislaine. Maxwell took the lead. First, you must wash your hands, she instructed. When giving a massage, keep one palm on the body so as not to startle the person. Then Maxwell pumped cream into both their hands and instructed Virginia to follow her lead in massaging Epstein's feet and legs. At his buttocks, when Virginia avoided them, Maxwell grabbed her hands and guided her hands onto them. Then Epstein asked her questions, including whether she was on birth control. She was confused. Why was he asking me this? Then he asked her about losing her virginity. And she wanted the job so desperately that she just blurted out so much. She gave him a rough overview of being abused by a family friend, although she didn't tell him about her father. Epstein called her a naughty girl. He said he liked naughty girls. Then he rolled over on his back and he had an erection. Maxwell carried on massaging his chest and acting as if nothing untoward was taking place. Epstein started pleasuring himself. Meanwhile, Maxwell was taking off her clothes and undressing Virginia. Only moments before, Virginia had felt hopeful, and now she wondered if sex was the only thing that anyone actually wanted from her. Then Maxwell ordered her to straddle Epstein, and he penetrated her. Then he showered, and Maxwell instructed her to shampoo Epstein. "She's a keeper," said Epstein. He put on sweatpants. Virginia put back on her Mar-A-Lago clothes. Then Epstein and Maxwell gave her $200, told her she did great, and asked her to come back the following day. Then the butler, Juan Alessi, drove her home. During this ride home, her brain and her thoughts started to return to her. She had become so desensitized in order to deal with what her father had done to her, that what had just taken place had been just like a whirlwind to her. She just went along with it. She didn't know how to say no. And some people listening to this will be shocked to hear that. But as someone, me, who knows about childhood sexual abuse, I know she's telling the truth. All the way home, she said she felt gutted. She went into her parents' house, not the trailer that her and Michael shared. Then she avoided her mum's questions and had a shower and wept at what had taken place. And so, she says, begins the period of her life that has been dissected more than any other. The worst things they did to me were not physical, but psychological. She spent the next 2 years in Epstein and Maxwell's orbit. She said there were no bars on the windows, but I was a prisoner trapped in an invisible cage. As before, she drifts back to a happy family event to almost shake off the way that she has felt, revealing what has happened for the first time that she met Epstein. She begins by recalling another innocuous anecdote. She's now on a shopping trip with her 12-year-old daughter, Ellie. Ellie presents as a tomboy, just as Virginia did when she was a young girl. Ellie has 2 older brothers. Virginia wanted a pretty sundress for Ellie, and to her surprise, Ellie chooses it. In addition, Virginia then buys 6 orange and striped beach towels on her way out, even though she knows her husband will be annoyed with her over purchasing. She said she needs to fill the home with fresh new things because she recalls how dirty she felt as a child. Again, I completely relate to what she's saying, and I believe her. And she talks about how young women and men criticized her for returning to Epstein, even though we knew what to expect. She said that people were saying, "How can you go back? You knew from the very first occasion what he was like." But she said that discounts what we have been through, including childhood abuse. No one cared about her, she said, but Epstein at least attempted to pretend to care. He threw a lifeline to us, she said. If we wanted to paint, he'd buy canvases for us. If we wanted to dance, he'd buy us dance classes. It was very coercive and manipulative. For so many years, I had been sexualized. I was a people pleaser. Men had cloaked their abuse of me as love. After the first night, Virginia returned the next day, as directed by Maxwell. They knew these young women could not resist the money as well. $200 then to a young girl. Most of these girls were runaways or impoverished. $200, almost too much to refuse, and especially when you've come from a background of abuse. Again, on the second night, Maxwell took her up the stairs and then to Epstein in the massage room. And then Epstein started to rationalize what he was about. He claimed he needed to climax at least 3 times a day. He said he had a biological impairment. It was health related and he needed that physical release constantly throughout the day. And Maxwell and Epstein became her sexual tutors. They guided her how to do everything, including not talking during foreplay and how to correctly give oral sex. Some of this detail, I have to say, was just too much for me. I don't care to hear about Maxwell and Epstein's sexual needs. And so I did struggle through this. Nonetheless, I listened to every single word of that audiobook. I didn't skip once because I felt the need to listen to it. And on the third day, Maxwell called her at Mar-A-Lago, and Maxwell was no longer full of charm because she had successfully recruited Virginia. Just over 2 days, Virginia had $400 in her pocket and she was feeling heard. She was being told that she would be sent on massage courses. And again, Virginia's dad dropped her off at Epstein's place. And without knowing what Virginia had said her father had done, I have always been critical about the role of her parents. I considered them to be enablers when it came to Maxwell and Epstein. And in fact, you know, it's like she had so much extensive abuse that being dropped off at their place probably felt at the start like some sort of relief. I mean, I don't know. But on that third occasion, she was in the kitchen. She was having fruit from a platter. And then Maxwell appeared. Maxwell was not the same jovial, chirpy person at all. She said she was going out. This concerned Virginia because even though Maxwell was an unpleasant character on those first 2 days by making her do things she hadn't wanted to do, she still felt that Maxwell's presence would stop Jeffrey Epstein becoming too brutal with her. But she went upstairs. She was alone with Epstein. Again, they had sex. From that point on, when Maxwell and Epstein were in Florida and Palm Beach, Virginia was a daily presence at their mansion. And 2 weeks in, and Epstein asked her to quit her job at Mar-A-Lago. The conditions were that she had to be available whenever he wanted to satisfy his lust. And she could no longer live in her parents' trailer with her boyfriend, as there were too many questions about her comings and goings. At that moment, Epstein handed her $2,500. He said, use this to rent yourself an apartment. She'd never had that much money before. She thanked him. It must have blown her away being given that money. It was a lot of money. She wanted him to keep her around. She says that she was frightened he would get rid of her. She said she saw dozens of girls come and go to his house over the next period, and she was concerned he would get rid of her like he had with them. Epstein then showed her a picture he had. It was of her little adored brother, Sky. He said, we know where he goes to school. You must never tell anyone what goes on here. I own the Palm Beach Police Department, and they won't do anything about it. By this point, she was 17. She had learned that men do harm and men get away with it. She had no choice but to accept it for her little brother's sake, if not her own. That's what she says. Now, this is a point where I don't entirely believe. I think she was absolutely seduced by the money, and I don't criticize her for that. £200 a throw for starters was big money to her, much less the $2,500 that she was then given. And the other lifestyle that Maxwell and Epstein promised her if she got on board and did what she wanted would have been absolutely seductive to a young abused individual. She was still so young. She'd been extensively abused, but there was more to her becoming fully employed by Epstein than fear. I do think to a degree there was like a sense of relief at the start and of escapism. I mean, she had been abused anyway at home, and then she'd been raped in care, and now she was at least being paid for it. I know that might sound mad to people who have not been in that place. She turned 17 on August the 9th, 2000, a Leo child. She used Epstein's money to rent and lease an apartment about 3 miles from Epstein's home. She was still with Michael. It sounded more like mates chilling with pizza, but not much else. He clearly didn't excite her. He didn't question what she was doing. He was just relieved that she was able to take care of the both of them. Meanwhile, her mother did have some suspicions. She wanted to know, what does this older couple want with you? Virginia was happy to hear her say it, but she thought it was a bit too little, too late. Because why wasn't her mum asking those questions when things were happening with her father and with Forrest? And it must have been so confusing for her. And I know it's really hard for people who've not been in her position to not understand how you return to your abusers, but people do. But by now, Virginia had become permanently available to Epstein and Maxwell, and Epstein bragged about his properties to her, about Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, about his New York house. The message was he was a very important man. Maxwell told the girls to call her G-Max. In October 2000, that was the occasion when Maxwell jetted to New York to meet her friend Prince Andrew. They went to model Heidi Klum's Halloween party and were there with Donald and Melania Trump. She talks a little about the great privilege and history of Ghislaine Maxwell. Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine's thief of a father, had died 9 years before Virginia had met Epstein, and she felt that Epstein had very craftily and manipulated into a gap that Ghislaine was missing now that her father had departed. They were supposed to be boyfriend and girlfriend, but they didn't act like it. Epstein and Maxwell predominantly had separate bedrooms and were barely publicly affectionate. The reality was she liked his money and he liked her connections. It was a mutual arrangement. Epstein described Maxwell as his best friend. I would tend to think that Maxwell was more in love with him than he was with her. And that was in part why she was happy to recruit girls, because he wanted girls, the younger the better, as he said. And Epstein told Virginia that he had previously been a maths teacher and he gave female students better grades if they agreed to sleep with him. We've heard all of that, and it was covered up. He still had a Brooklyn accent, despite wanting to give this very middle-class kind of Harvard impression to people. She talks about how particular he was about his food. He had a kind of regular diet of tofu, salmon, ginger, and chickpeas. He was a germaphobe. He refused to shake hands and required clean sheets on his bed every day. Yet he never wore a condom and required his girls to have health checks every few months. He believed the rules did not apply to him. He believed his money had inured him from the laws that govern the rest of us. Virginia first traveled with Maxwell and Epstein in the autumn of 2000. They took one of Epstein's private jets. It was first from Palm Beach to New York, then to his island in Little St. James, but Epstein called it Little St. Jeff's. The flight logs show that Virginia accompanied Epstein 32 times on his flights, and Maxwell was there for 23 of those trips. And Virginia says that those 32 times only represent a tiny fraction of her traveling. They also booked her onto other flights to go to see Epstein, where he was in other parts of the world. There were other people involved. There was a woman called Sarah Kellen who was on this flight. Epstein's staff were also aware of what was going on, from butlers to housekeepers to chauffeurs. They knew. Some of them denied it, but they knew that young women were being brought backwards and forwards and trafficked. They might not have known the inner details, but they knew there were a lot of young girls going backwards and forwards. And the reality is, Virginia was overwhelmed by the grandeur and the splendor of his homes. He loved art. He had giant chandeliers everywhere. And again, she turns to her critics. She's very concerned about critics who talk about how these girls were blown away by the wealth and luxury. And she acknowledges that Maxwell and Epstein gave her a world that she had not experienced, but the price that she had to pay was high. Epstein sometimes insisted that she call him daddy. Maxwell taught her etiquette, how to hold her knife correctly, how to dress better. They had her teeth whitened. Maxwell was absolutely a groomer of these girls as well as being a pimp. There were moments when Maxwell appeared to care about Virginia, and that often happens when you're dealing with narky people, because if they're constantly horrible to you, you won't be taken in. But if they're able to switch, it throws you off. You don't know where you are with them at any given moment in time. And as one example, Virginia recalls hearing Coldplay's Yellow on a car radio. She loved that song. I love that song, actually. Next day, Maxwell gave her a Coldplay CD. Maxwell also bought her a phone. And she said Maxwell sometimes felt like a mother to her. How complex must these feelings be? But humans are like that. We are not one-dimensional. We are multi-dimensional. She was being abused, but at the same time, she was being taken care of in a way that she hadn't. On another occasion, she recalls swimming into jellyfish and getting stung. And Maxwell urinated on her. The agony subsided. They loved gathering treasures on the beach together. Virginia felt bonded to Maxwell. And then on occasions she didn't, when Maxwell turned on her. Maxwell and Epstein gave her erotic books, including The Story of O. They watched TV together. Epstein loved Sex and the City. And Virginia recalls this familiar look that would come over his face when he wanted sex. And when he did, Maxwell would then turn to Virginia and instruct her to undress. They had a protocol. And Virginia was a favorite of Epstein. He favored her for a period of time. And again, that is not unusual in trafficking situations. But the truth is, and Virginia acknowledges this, that for the most part, he preferred girls with little or no experience, and he preferred girls to be virgins. But that was not Virginia. She thinks what he liked about her was that she had learned from a very early age to read the room. What do people want? How can I please people? And again, those are absolutely traits of abused children. She was detached. She never made demands on him. She said she had been trained to accept whatever affection she could get. She wondered if Epstein had been abused as a child. Only once had she questioned him about his childhood. He refused to answer. And years later, when he was under oath, he refused to answer again. She talked about being on Epstein's Island with Chef Lang, later a celebrity chef. She said Epstein liked the girls to walk around naked on the island, including in front of the chef. Epstein also liked the girls to stay thin, and she considered it very fun and rebellious when the chef gave her pizza and beer. Virginia was now at the point where she was also dressing Epstein, putting on his clothes, putting on his socks and shoes. He triangulated the girls, pitting them against each other. He showed her his trophy closet, which had numerous photos of young and underage girls. By this point now, Virginia was starting to be a recruiter herself. And this is one of the things that I definitely criticized Virginia for and didn't like when she was alive. I didn't feel that she had fully owned this, but she does in the book. And what happened was Virginia and Sarah Kellen, the girl I mentioned before, who Virginia clearly didn't like, they began recruiting girls during a trip to the island. She said Epstein had preferences, preferably white, between the ages of 12 and 17 years old. No piercings, no tattoos, must be vulnerable. And the girls liked recruiting, she said, because they could double their earnings to $400 and wouldn't have to service him themselves. She believed that she was suffering Stockholm Syndrome. She had feelings for him too. She feels guilt for recruiting girls, and she comes back to it on several occasions throughout the book. For his 48th birthday, Virginia allowed Maxwell to take nude pictures of her, and she realized that she had now become one of those abused trophy images in the closet. Then her being loaned out and trafficked started. She recalled being trafficked to other people, including wealthy billionaire number one and his pregnant wife at a hotel. She massaged the woman, and then she went to billionaire number one for a floor massage. She had sex with him. In the taxi on the way home, she felt Epstein would be happy with her, and she had done what he asked. She was so groomed, she no longer realized she was being trafficked. Her behavior now seemed almost normal to her. Then she switches again to more pleasant times with her family. It's almost like she's split in half and reflecting on her children and her husband to cleanse her of these memories. She says Epstein had a scientific rationale for the girls he chose. He felt he needed them to have started to enter puberty, and he was guiding them and checking their fertility. He said laws on having sex were arbitrary, and he compared the different ages of consent around the world. Predators are like this. They will use anything to justify their perversions, and Epstein was no different. Meanwhile, Epstein was concerned Virginia was not giving him her all. He had told her she should be enjoying what he did to her. Nobody wants a dead horse, he told her. He told her to be more vibrant. She spent much of the time with Epstein off her face on Xanax and ecstasy, even though he loathed drugs. She felt sick with herself. The second person he trafficked her to was a psychology professor. Again, we are not given a name. She flew commercial to the island where the professor met her. She was alone on the island with him except for a housekeeper. She massaged him and had sex with him. She was trafficked to a multitude of powerful men, a former US senator, academics, former head of state, royalty. Then we get to something that has been much talked about, and you get the impression that Virginia is now holding back at this point. And by the end of the book, you realize why. And that is the subject of blackmail. She didn't know if it was true that Epstein had cameras in every room, but she did know he had a huge collection of video recordings. In the Manhattan townhouse, Epstein had showed her a recording room. He said it was good to have something on people. She gives you a little idea, but does not go into any great detail about what this entailed. There is a sense that even in her posthumous tell-all book, many things are still off limits, and they are, including the names of people she accuses of being trafficked to. As said, she felt a certain bonding with Epstein. He started to take her places without Maxwell, including to Zorro Ranch. One was an event for billionaires. And Virginia was now recruiting other girls regularly. On one occasion at this event, she went shopping. She met a beautiful blonde girl, and then she recruited her and invited her to the hotel. She bathed the girl ready for Epstein, and she was delighted with how happy that she had made him. She felt bad about the girls on reflection, but you can see why me, as someone who reports on sex trafficking, on abuse, had a lot of problems with somebody who'd been abused, them being involved in the abuse process. But actually, it was reading the book that I was able to understand more completely how such a thing could have occurred. She reflects on some of Epstein's planes. She remembers, for example, being on the plane with the Simpsons creator, Matt Groening. It was February the 23rd, 2001. She was on one flight. She was asked to massage his feet. She recalls that they were terrible, disgusting feet. She'd been a Simpsons fan, and here was the creator. It must have been surreal for her. You can see why a young girl from a background of abuse would be blown away by it all. Then Epstein brought in his other girls for orgies with Virginia. She couldn't square the circle of his private perversions and his public image of pictures with royalty and the Dalai Lama. She recalled Victoria's Secret's boss, Les Wexner, being around. She hoped some of the power and importance of these men who associated with Epstein would rub off on her. Epstein had several planes. One he liked to call the Lolita Express. That was not just a media term. There were private cabins on board where girls were raped. She recalls flying to London with Epstein, Maxwell, and Maxwell's assistant, Taylor, whose father was an Oxford professor. Next morning, she was woken and told she was going to meet a prince. She and Maxwell went shopping. She showered and got back to the Muse house in Mayfair, showered, put on clothes, reminded her of Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera. And then Prince Andrew arrived at Ghislaine's Mayfair Muse house. Ghislaine said, "Guess Jenna's age." He was 41 and he correctly guessed she was 17. He told her, "My daughters are a little younger than you." Ghislaine made some kind of joke about how they'd soon have to trade in Virginia because she was getting too old. Virginia said at the time he was attractive. He'd been portrayed as a playboy. Epstein called him Andy, and so Virginia did too. She thought, my mum would not forgive me. Oh, let me just get rid of that image there. She thought, my mum would not forgive me if I don't get a picture with this important man, with a prince. And she had with her a disposable camera. And she said Jeffrey Epstein took this picture. They then went to dinner and then on to Tramp nightclub. She recalls Andrew sweating profusely, even though he said to Emily Maitlis in that lying news night interview that he had some sort of medical issue where he couldn't sweat. She recalls him being a bumbling dancer. They went back to Maxwell's Muse house in 2 cars. Andrew was with his security detail. And this is exactly why I say and always say the people around them do know. They do. It's just a lot of them choose to remain quiet. Virginia was in the car with Maxwell. Then they got into the house and she was instructed to do for Andrew what she had done for Jeffrey. And Maxwell and Epstein, they headed upstairs. Victoria ran Andrew a bath. This is all her recollection. Andrew played with her feet. She said he was entitled, like having sex with her was his birthright. She said in total, the time with him lasted about half an hour. The next morning, Maxwell told her she had done very well. And Epstein gave her £15,000 for servicing Andy. Again, what an incentive for a child that feels abandoned by her family, abused, a runaway, a gun had been stuck in her mouth. She'd been repeatedly raped. Imagine being given $15,000 rather for having sex with a prince. Just imagine that. I mean, a lot of people can't. She called her boyfriend and told him what had happened. He sounded worried. Maxwell, by this point, had confiscated her passport, and she was genuinely, she said, scared for her safety. When she returned to Florida, she printed out the photos. On the back of this image was March the 13th, 2001, and that was the date of the printing. The second encounter with Prince Andrew, she said, took place 1 month later at Epstein's place in New York. It was April 2001. Another female arrived and Virginia and the girl were positioned next to the prince with one on his lap. Virginia felt like they were puppets on a string. She claimed she had sex with Andrew for a second time here. In May 2001, she flew to the French Riviera for a yacht party to celebrate Naomi Campbell's birthday. We've seen the picture. There she is at the front. Look how young she is. Even Naomi Campbell is looking like, what the hell is going on here? You can only just see, but the person next to Virginia is Ghislaine Maxwell. Virginia looks like a baby, absolute baby. And so, you know, it's obscene that all these adults were around and they did nothing. And she wore the same outfit that she had for Prince Andrew. And now at this point in the book, she's talking about being trafficked to billionaire number 2. But again, no name. This man offered to employ her at more money than Epstein had given her. She told Epstein, and he said, wow, that's a lot of money. She believed, that he adored her. She claimed she had sex with Prince Andrew for a third time on Epstein's Island. She said it was an orgy. She was about 18. The other girls appeared younger and couldn't speak English. She said it was her, it was Andrew, it was Jeffrey Epstein and 8 other girls. Again, this is a new revelation. She had a miscarriage a couple of weeks later. She has a hazy memory of being in a room with Epstein. A gentleman's agreement, she said, was forged between Epstein and the doctor. Only when she was discharged that she began to piece together what had happened. There was a tiny incision near her belly button, which was consistent with surgery for an ectopic pregnancy. She said she had seen medical notes since, but it did not state that she'd had a miscarriage. So had they just removed the growing child? Is that what they'd done? Because neither Epstein nor the men that she was trafficked to wore condoms. None of them, she said. No one cared what she had gone through, and she began to care less. And Epstein was getting increasingly sadomasochistic with her, forcing her to wear studded masks and being brutal with her. By now, she had added coke to her drug use, and Epstein said she was dead-eyed and he was not happy with her. He stopped paying her bills. She worked briefly at an animal hospital, but they fired her. Drugs began to leave her system, and she began to feel more like herself again. In November 2001, Ron Eppinger pleaded guilty to charges of smuggling women to the USA for prostitution. He spent time in prison. He had a fine and a forfeiture of the vehicles, including the one that he had used to pick up Virginia. To her certainty, privileged men could get away with anything. Again, more complex motions creep in for her. Now Virginia was finding out that Epstein had replaced her with Sarah Kellen. She felt hurt. She felt abandoned. She was working at TGI Fridays and other restaurants. Her brother was getting married and she was happy. Then she was accused of stealing from the tip jar. It was actually her boyfriend, but she paid the money back. Her luck with men was clearly not improving. Then Epstein called her again. He said, "Come for lunch." Only when he was satisfied during the conversation that she was clean. He asked her how she was, clean from drugs, that is. He took her to the massage room and she said, "I was back under his thumb," and it began all over again. Epstein told her he had always improved the lives of the girls he worked with, and he worked as a matchmaker for other girls and wealthy clients and had married off at least one of these women to a wealthy man. Now, I'm going to say at this point, this is not fact. This is, many people believe, for example, that this is in reference to Melania and Donald Trump. And actually, things are heating up in the US in a lawsuit featuring journalist Michael Wolff. The journalist is suing Melania Trump. He says he'll ask the First Lady and Donald Trump about Epstein under oath. I think it's going to be interesting. It comes after Melania had threatened to sue the author over claims he made that she allegedly had ties to Epstein. So Melania absolutely denies any ties to Epstein whatsoever. Nonetheless, Jeffrey Epstein bragged about how he essentially brought these young trafficked women together with very rich men. He said he was a matchmaker. He saw himself as doing good. He said he wanted to have multiple babies. He was so convinced of his own power that he wanted to use Zorro Ranch as a breeding ground. And many people believe that he did. It is possible that Virginia was not privy to all elements of his life. That is possible. Abusers do that as well. They create those kind of like demarcation lines. Virginia was with Epstein and Maxwell for 2 years. She cannot remember how many men she was forced to have sex with. She said there was one very violent man that Epstein trafficked me to a man on the island, and she's talked in legal filings about him but does not name him. And she said he was violent. He choked her until she lost consciousness. He took pleasure in her pain. She emerged bleeding all over. She begged Epstein not to send her back to him, but he wouldn't make her any promises. "You'll get that sometimes," he said. She said it was this that woke her up to Epstein. And in her legal filing, she claims that this is Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel. Of course, again, I am not stating that is fact, that he was that brutal man, but that's what her legal filings state, although not her book. And again, she was actually sent back to meet whoever this violent man was again on Epstein's plane. And she said it was less violent than before. Then Maxwell and Epstein said they wanted to have a baby with her. They offered her a great deal, including her own mansion. They said, "You have to sign over your child to us, but you have to be available to travel with the child whenever we want to." And this was a year after she'd had what she thought might be a miscarriage. She was scared to say no, and she began looking for ways to escape. First of all, she agreed to have their baby, but she wanted her massage promise held, the one where they said they were going to get her trained. So it was at this point that Maxwell found a school in Thailand to train her up. But it wasn't just about sending her to get trained to massage. They also had a girl they wanted Virginia to hook up with and bring back to the States for them. So this is like the next point of her life when things again start to change. She sets out on this journey. It starts with her taking pictures. She's boarding a plane to Asia and to a massage therapy course that she'd been booked onto. The trafficking, she said, was horrific, but she also acknowledged that it enabled her to travel extensively. And she reflected on that, again, really complex emotions. And it's really easy for outsiders to go, well, she made plenty from that, or she went back. Well, I have to say that if that is your go-to reaction to a lot of her actions, then you really don't understand what survivors of abuse, and particularly survivors of child abuse, go through. It is a very complex scenario indeed. It isn't as straightforward as just saying, well, don't take that money, don't go to that person. It's not that straightforward. And anybody who believes that is really revealing their own naivety. But I do understand why people would say that as well. But it's not accurate, and it's not actually fair. But going to Asia, she felt a sense of freedom that she hadn't in a while. She went to the international massage school that she'd been enrolled to. They taught her Thai massage. She loved it. It didn't involve any oils. There were no massage tables. It was clients lying on the floor. She felt free to get to know people her own age. Epstein and Maxwell sent her regular money. Again, she started spending on drugs and mixing in dangerous situations. Because when you come from that sort of background, it's kind of like a default position. She put herself in precarious situations with druggies, but the long-term abuse made her believe she wasn't worth being safe or being protected. That's the reality. And then her life changed completely. A week into her studies, she met an Australian guy called Matt. He said his best friend, Robbie, was there studying martial arts. And one evening she was searching for Matt, but she spotted this kind of like dark-haired man that everyone was paying attention to. She felt instantly drawn to him. It was Matt's friend, Robbie. I'm sure I have an image of her and Robbie. Let me just bring that in. And they both said it was love at first sight. That's what they felt like. But they were kids. They were away from home. And I'm sure it felt incredibly, it must have been a real kind of heady experience. He was 26 and she was 19. He was religious and from a Sicilian family. I wonder if I have got a picture of her with Robbie here. I'm sure. There we go. Let's just bring that out. This image, of course, is them when they're much older. This isn't at the start of their relationship, but nonetheless, it gives you an idea of the man who she believed had rescued her and was her savior. He wanted to protect her, she said. He told her he was a scrapper. He described himself as a bully basher. Then they kissed, and then that was it. He wanted to know how she could afford the hotel room, and he wanted to know so much more about her. So she told Robbie that she worked for a rich, powerful man who abused her and had a woman who orchestrated his army of girls. He wanted to know where her family was, as you can imagine anybody would. I certainly did. She told him that she'd had a rough childhood. He told her that she didn't need to reveal details about her life at that moment in time. He just was happy to be there for her. She said it felt like a different Jenna when she was with him. And he said he wanted her to be herself, and she wasn't used to this. She was used to performing, to being what other people wanted her to be. And a week after knowing each other, he proposed. He said he would have her back until the day she died. Then they moved quickly, but believed it was destiny. And on October the 16th, 2002 rather, just 10 days after they had met, they married in a temple on a mountain. And again, this feels like her escaping. She felt like she was in a dream. They called their parents, his in Australia, hers back in America. But before her wedding day was over, she said she had one more call to make, and that was to call Maxwell and Epstein. She dialed Epstein's number. She was scared, and he answered the phone. She said, "I fell in love and got married, Jeffrey. I'm never coming back." And he said to her, "Have a great life," and put down the phone. And they wouldn't speak again for 5 years. Again, she uses music to relate to telling her story. This time now she's on to Eminem's Lose Yourself, which encapsulated her new life. You only get one shot. This opportunity only comes once in a lifetime. That was how she saw Robbie in her life. She moved out the hotel and withdrew from her course. She rented a property close to the ocean. She was still obsessed with being thin, but she was healing. Slowly, she started to tell Robbie about her childhood abuse. She felt that meeting Robbie Robbie when she did was divine intervention. She was so vulnerable, bless her. She had a blue butterfly tattooed. In love with Robbie G. Robbie spelt wrong. They'd only put one B in it. For me, as a reader, as a listener, it acts like a red flag when you know what comes at the end of her story. But also it felt like her having that tattoo and of a butterfly and the associations with MK Ultra programming and the monarch butterfly, all of that kind of made me a bit shivery. And it felt like she was continuing to be branded and be the property of a man. Then trouble hit them. They were robbed of £2,000. They were left with a couple of hundred only. Robbie's parents sent money for her to fly to Sydney. They couldn't get on the same flight. They had to travel separately. She landed in Singapore and customs descended all over her. She eventually got to Australia and were greeted by his parents. And an hour later, Robbie arrived. Now her new life could begin. In the first week in Australia, she got sick. She went camping with Robbie and some friends. She noted the huge difference to her privileged living with Epstein, and she was sick with fever. And it was Robbie's father who nurtured her like a daughter, and she hadn't experienced that before. She felt that any man who had pretended to nurture her only wanted her for sex, but Robbie's father was different. Robbie's father acted like a father to her. And if that was truly her first experience in life, that would have been quite overwhelming. The Giuffre women were more skeptical until she did a day of cooking with them. And then she was okay from that point onwards. She started to adjust to her new life and face up to the problem issues that she had quite naturally with sex. They were still living with Robbie's parents. They bought a Jack Russell, and in early 2003, they moved into their own apartment. By now, Robbie and Virginia were fighting after drinking, not dissimilar to the kind of what she'd seen with her own parents. Robbie was angry and that she didn't do more at home. She was angry he was late coming home from work. They were both trying to fulfill roles and struggling with them. He gave her money to buy furniture because they didn't even have a sofa. They had nowhere to sit. And she went out and bought an Xbox instead. She said she was completely unprepared to run a household. She never knew how to do it. But she bought something that she thought would be of comfort. Sometime around this point, her mum and dad had separated. She asked her dad to sell her stuff, and that was in storage, and a car that she had. He ended up only wiring her $500. She felt certain he had stolen from her. She didn't tell Robbie, but she was still taking Xanax. She had flashbacks. She was haunted by the nightmares of not being able to get away from her abusers. And by now, Robbie's mum was nurturing her in a way that her own mum hadn't. And so again, Robbie's parents were giving her the nurturing that she so desperately needed. She talks about Robbie's temper and how they always came back together again after the outbursts. Then they moved to Sydney. She began working as a receptionist by day and a waitress by night. Their first child was due. She had been worried that she wouldn't be able to have children after the extensive abuse that she had suffered and after losing a baby. She loved being pregnant. She said her first child, Alexander, was born in February 2006. 5 months after the birth of Alexander, she was pregnant again. She wanted a reconciliation with her father, and he came to Australia. Her mum wouldn't fly. She has a picture of her dad pressing a beer bottle to her baby's lips. It says so much, doesn't it? And again, I'm sure, because I did certainly, like, why the hell do you want that man around your babies? But very complex emotions, extremely complex emotions. And I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist and not attempting to diagnose her, but very complex indeed. But then in 2007, Maxwell rang her. She was breezy. She was charming. Apparently, Jeffrey Epstein was now being investigated. And Maxwell was outraged. After all he's done for you girls, she said. Maxwell didn't want Virginia to speak, said that they'd take care of her. And by this point, Virginia was 8 months pregnant. She promised not to say anything. Then Epstein called her. He said his lawyer was recording the conversation. An investigation was ongoing, and the girls who turned against him were smeared as druggies, skanks, and prostitutes. A few days passed, and then the FBI rang, said she had been identified as a victim of Epstein, saying photos were found in his Palm Beach house. She had wanted to leave Maxwell and Epstein behind for her new life with Robbie and her child, but they had come back into her life. It was at this point that she began reading the evidence against Epstein. It was also similar to what she had experienced. It was the same vulnerable girls that she had been. One was 14 and he had given her £300 to abuse her. Another was 16 years old. Recordings had been seized from Epstein's properties. Then Virginia catalogues how a smear and intimidation campaign against her began. The grand jury for Epstein was rescheduled. People who reported Epstein were stalked and followed. And then she details what we then know was this outrageous deal that Epstein struck that made him essentially be allowed largely to escape justice the first time around. He was handed a deal. He pled guilty to one count of aggravated assault, 5 years probation, and no unsupervised visits with minors. And any time that he did spend in jail, he was out every day at his mansion. The grand jury was there were so many issues with the grand jury. It was clear there was tampering taking place. Then in July 2006, Epstein, arrested for procuring a minor and for solicitation. He posted bond. He went home. It was just 2 victims, but he had hundreds. And actually, it was all 2006, 2007. And the grand jury then happened. They returned a single charge to which Epstein pleaded not guilty. It was a botched case that the people were in charge were said to be furious about. They sent it to the FBI. Nonetheless, despite all of this, she was absolutely intent in moving forward. She was, by this point, a mother of 2 boys and a little girl by now. The girl reinforced her belief that she needed to get justice for survivors. She also recalls her father, Sky Roberts, flying out from America. Not that one, excuse me. She recalls her father once again flying out from America to Australia to see her newly born daughter and his latest grandchild. Over the next few days, her father and Robbie clashed and her father had to leave. Robbie had called him a pedo and, well, it went downhill from there, really. She paid for her father to stay in a motel and she paid to change his tickets to get him back home early. She couldn't understand why she was still trying to be okay with a man who had done so much to her. But she later discovered, as indeed did I, that this is not uncommon with survivors of abuse. It's not uncommon to seek approval from the one who hurt you in the first place. Sometime later, she was approached by lawyers. She thought it was to prosecute Epstein, but it turned out to be a civil case. She was anonymous at this point and known as Jane Doe. She received $500,000 to settle anonymously with Epstein. This was later held against her. People thought she was money hungry. Then a Daily Mail journalist tracked her down and eventually flew to Australia to interview her. Now, this resulted in a Mail article that showed that first picture of her with Andrew. She had given a copy of the image to the journalist. And after that, she said the FBI took away all her evidence, including this picture, and she never got it back. They did send her a copy of a disc with all her evidence on, though, but they didn't return all her original documentation or this picture to her. It was at this point that her and Robbie, for whatever reason, decided that they wanted to go and live in America. They took their family with them, of course. They were not having a good time. They were only there for 2 years. The schools were overcrowded, and she decided to home educate her children. Some days they played classical music. Some days they played Eminem. It's so painful to hear her words. I have no doubt that she was a devoted and loving mother. I have no doubt that her life was difficult. Then her dad moved to be closer to them. Her children started to spend time with him. It was at this point that it was all becoming way too much for me. I struggled to hear this, having known what Virginia had said that he'd done to her. They got Ellie, her daughter, a horse, and she remembered bonding with her dad over her love of Alice, her horse, the horse that he had bought her and then sold when she was a runaway. I was getting a weird sense of foreboding listening to her tell these anecdotes. I truly don't understand why you would allow your children around a man whom you know to rape children, according to you. But again, complex. I'm really trying to not make too many judgments about her, because I think being a survivor of child abuse and then being trafficked is such a complex situation that to make any judgment of her is really only to look at the kind of like the surface of what's taking place and not at kind of like the deeper issues underneath. And then Virginia talked more and more about the therapy she had found. And I kept thinking, but you die at the end of all of this. It was a very discomforting sensation when listening to her audiobook when you actually know the tragic outcome. There are times when she has this sunny optimism about how she's going to be this warrior and kick ass and bring these pedos to justice. And that's just how I feel a lot of the time. And we, the listeners, the readers, are supposed to be taking some motivation and empowerment from it all. And I keep thinking, but you killed yourself. It's so weird to think that this woman, still young, is no longer here. But her words, as much as they are hers, continue on. She then details how she started working with Brad, a lawyer, and then David Boyes, a more swanky one on Lexington Avenue in New York. And together they were all piecing together the names and the faces of the powerful, influential, and famous men she said she had been trafficked to. Often throughout these recollections, she talks to her critic. She says, people say, how can you remember anything when you were strung out on Xanax and other drugs? But she says she did. But I have to question, is that true? I ask because she dropped her case against lawyer Alan Dershowitz in 2022 after many years of saying that he abused her on multiple occasions. In their settlement, she said she may have made a mistake in identifying Mr. Dershowitz. Now, Alan Dershowitz denied the allegations. He sued Virginia for defamation. And there was a counter defamation claim from Giuffre's side as well. And that was when they agreed to a settlement. But it was these moments when I became more critical about Virginia that I had to remember that she had been emotionally disrupted, whatever had happened to her when she was young. And I am in no doubt she was sexual and she had been abused, and whatever had happened to her, she was not going to be like a person who had not experienced that. There were other times that my heart absolutely panged for her, like the time she was told her father had accepted money from Epstein to buy his silence. And she then flicks back to them being in the States and how it was going badly. Robbie had said he wanted to end her father. She began to regret returning to Florida. It was time to leave. And she said, when we put our minds to get something done, we got it done. She moved swiftly into moving mode and then into confronting her dad about him taking bribery money from Epstein. He didn't deny it. She was broken by her dad. How much more, she said, can one person fail me? And she was alone in the house when they were preparing to move on, when she saw her dad pull up outside. She said he was swaggering and ready to have a fight with Robbie. She stopped him, threatened him with the police. She said he stopped pushing her. Then he noticed there was no furniture in the front room. It had all been packed up. She said she can't erase the memory of his face. It was like his face almost imploded. And he said, can I see my grandchildren? She said, no, you can't. He began sobbing. You're my baby girl, he cried. If you leave, I'm going to have no one to look after me. Who is going to take care of me? She told him he had to go before Robbie came back in. He turned, walked to his car and drove off. And that was the last time that Virginia Roberts Giuffre saw her father. The next stop was Colorado, and there was an attempt at reuniting with her mum. Again, she refers to songs. She refers to a Kelly Clarkson song that soothed her, about a neglectful father, and then about Kelly finding a good husband. She was 31 at this point. She felt her life was a constant fight, a hurricane. They moved with their 3 children in a menagerie, including a snake, 3 dogs, cats, and fish, who froze to death while they were parked up in a motel, and ferrets that broke loose at the same time. Half the time, when you're reading this or listening to this, you are uncertain whether you're in a Hollywood script, but the flow is generally easy on the ear. And she was very good at telling a story, and she does that well in this book. And again, when I say that, I think, but she's dead. This is all weird that I am reviewing her book and she's not here to see the response in the world to her book being released. So she attempted this relationship with her mum. She hadn't seen her mum in a few years and she hoped to patch up with her. Her mum didn't want to talk about the past, and Virginia had to accept that if they were going to have a relationship that she wouldn't be able to. You know what? I gave Virginia 10 out of 10 for trying. Her parents sound absolutely horrendous, according to her. And I personally wouldn't have the aptitude or patience to deal with such parents if that were me. And I speak from my own personal experience of refusing to see my father, who had abandoned me when I was 3 years old. That doesn't mean it's right. That was just my route. So I definitely would not have tolerated her parents. And Virginia recalled her mum being loving when she was little, but my view of her mother is not that. It is of a woman who failed that young child in catastrophic ways. Maybe Virginia is far more forgiving than I am. She then also details in her book about how newspapers came after her when she started speaking out and naming names. They smeared her, portraying her as an immoral prostitute rather than a minor who had been trafficked. She was up against some stuff, including attacks on her motherhood and what kind of a role model she was to them. It's some victim shaming stuff, frankly. But I also saw another side to Victoria that I didn't like. I saw the way she took against another survivor, and I didn't like that. Molly Skye Brown is somebody that I've interviewed. She'd been approached by Maxwell, who had also attempted to recruit Molly. And Molly had attempted to communicate that with Virginia and to join up with Virginia and other survivors and give her some intel. She thought it would help Virginia in their case. But Virginia and another Epstein woman were cruel to Molly. They laughed that she was an almost victim. But Molly was also a survivor, and I didn't like the way they acted towards her. And I've interviewed Molly and I've covered her story on several occasions. She was also approached by Prince Andrew's assistant in an attempt to get her on side, because Molly had stated quite clearly that she believed the picture of Virginia and Prince Andrew was fake. And on another occasion, Virginia took against me for interviewing another survivor of child abuse that she didn't like. I never got a chance to know Virginia personally. We were pitted against each other online and in the arena of survivors of establishment abuse, her being the victim of it and me, the reporter of it. By part 4, she's into warrior mode. It's a point of no return. This is where she has become empowered, and it's lovely to hear. She recalls the time that she went to be interviewed by ABC. She was excited. She saw it as a game changer. She wanted to blow the whistle on the US government for hiding Maxwell and Epstein's crimes. The interview went well. It lasted about 90 minutes. Virginia gave names and times. She felt good about it, like she had spoken from the heart. A segment was due to air on a major breakfast show. Then the waiting began and nothing appeared. The network told her that there'd been a delay, and then it turned out that because she had named Prince Andrew in the interview, the network had gone to the palace. The palace had stepped in and stopped it. And the reporter admitted that it was between Epstein and the royal family that had stopped this interview. And I talked about that. I think it was on Monday's show. And that was, again, when there was an intervention, I think, from the Queen. It must have been so scary for Virginia that you can even speak to a major news network and these people can intervene to delay your information coming out. You know, she whitewashes over her time in the States with Robbie. Maybe I missed it, but I didn't hear her talk about him being convicted for domestic violence against her. She wants to portray him as her savior, and she does that. She said it was time for them to leave the States after 10 years because they were concerned for their safety in light of her calling out powerful men. So they were set to return in 2015. Robbie flew out to Australia first and she would follow with the children. She felt she still had some loose ends to tie up in the States. She was now working with people she liked and trusted and continued investigating the men she had been trafficked to. She sued Maxwell for defamation in order to establish that they would be able to reveal details that they previously hadn't. And she talked about the fear towards the end of her 2 years in the US. She recounts a situation where she was forced to sleep with a gun because she was concerned what would happen to her and her children. And because unknown cars kept appearing on her dirt road, she was convinced that they were sent to intimidate her from Epstein and Maxwell. And back in Australia, she struggled to reestablish herself again. But 2016 was a better year for her. That was a year of deposition against Maxwell and Epstein. A deposition is an out-of-court statement by a witness taken under oath and often recorded for later use in a legal proceeding. And what happened was that her witnesses totally corroborated what had happened to her, including the trafficking she had experienced and including being trafficked to Prince Andrew. She recalls Maxwell being sworn in and denying pretty much any of Virginia's claims about her, including anything to do with sex and Epstein. She called Virginia a fantasist. She denied hearing Epstein say that he liked them, the younger, the better. In the end, she settled with Maxine, but cannot talk about those details. Again, she turns to her critics to address the issue of settlement and why survivors sometimes have to do that. She said the money helped her and her family. Working was almost impossible for her. By now, she had become famously known as a trafficked sex slave, and regular jobs just didn't want to take her on. By this point, like coming close to the end of the book, she started to reflect on the time that the Maxwell trial took her away from spending time with her children. And by this point, the Me Too era had arrived, and it came out that one of her lawyers, David Boies, had been involved with attempting to stop Weinstein's accusers. Boies later said it was a mistake, but it was surely a conflict for Virginia. Like everything else that is uncomfortable, she glides over it very, very quickly. She acknowledges it and then moves on. She doesn't necessarily go into how problematic it is having somebody represent a trafficked victim when he/his firm has been involved in smearing other victims of trafficking. So it doesn't look good. And certainly me, as a reporter of it, I was highly critical of her involvement with him when that all came out. As I say, Boies later said it was a mistake, but it had to have been a conflict for her. And before you know it, she's back again talking about her home life and how it was improving and how she'd used the Maxwell money to buy a 4-bed house in Australia. It's really kind of breathy stuff. But as I say, the David Boies story hung around her like a bad smell when she was still alive. And then she starts to sense that she's really finally starting to get a taste of justice, because it was July 2019. She was informed that Epstein had been arrested, charges relating to sex trafficking. Agents raided his home in New York and found huge volumes of nude images of underage girls and young females. They also found a safe containing diamonds and 3 passports for Jeffrey Epstein. One was for Australia, which had expired. One was for the USA and one was for Israel. Epstein was given no bail whatsoever. His money was revealed at the time as being in excess of $550 million, but it was almost certainly much more. Then she heard about his death on the 10th of August 2019. A month later, he was dead at 66. She was disappointed. She said this was not how justice was supposed to work. She wasn't happy he was dead. She was actually also in mourning. She said she was grieving her inability to hold him accountable. She says, absolutely, his death was fishy. She will never be convinced that he took his own life. Even though the authorities had concluded that his death was a perfect storm of screw-ups. And she also says that she does not believe that he was buried in an unmarked grave in Palm Beach. She said he wanted to go into a cryogenic chamber until he could be brought back to life. And she wouldn't put it past him if he'd managed to organize this. He'd also made it very difficult for his victims to get their hands on any compensation, but they managed to file claims by taking advantage of a new ruling. Let me take this. By this point, she's starting to come together with other survivors. She sees it as sisters uniting. It must have been quite a comforting period of time for her. She'd now given a significant amount of media interviews. This is by the point where she'd become famous, and she felt it was evident that Andrew would now know he had to face the music. She talks about the disaster that was the Emily Maitlis interview. I'm sure we can all remember that. But she was outraged at his denial of her, but she said it helped her legal team build an ironclad case against him. She said they weren't ready to sue just yet, but were getting closer. And Virginia had to respond to an interviewer who asked her if the photo was fake. She said it was absolutely real, for goodness sake. She said, this is a story about abuse. This is not about willing prostitutes. This is about young trafficked girls. This is about the complicity of all the people who knew. And her drive for justice was incredible. And still, I am here going, but what happened at the end? It had all become too much for her. It had all become too much for her. For her warrior power, she was also a vulnerable woman who had a foundation of child abuse. I definitely believe her. She became burnt out during these intense media rounds, and I witnessed that. I could see that in her. She took time out to rest and recharge. Her health suffered. She had numerous problems. She became delirious. She had meningitis. She said she fell. She broke her neck. She had issues with her throat that required surgery. Her health issues went on and on. Robbie got her a French bulldog to cheer her up after she broke her neck. It's almost surreal the way she seems to breeze from one disaster to another and then switch the mood. I wonder if these are all trauma responses. I suspect they are. Finally, the proper arrest of Maxwell happened. The intense spotlight where she became a world's most wanted suspect and then got caught. It must have been so insane for Virginia to see the turnaround from these overprivileged sex attackers to them being in chains. The judgment of her and young women accepting money continued to upset her. And again, I don't blame people for being judgmental about this. It is difficult. She was surprised that people couldn't see that they could still be victims even when they accepted money. It upset her when a reporter she thought had been a friend got involved with newspaper stories portraying her as a blackmailing whore. But the truth is, we live in a crummy world. Even this reporter who claimed to be a friend eventually turned on her. The great thing is, she got to live to see some justice for the people who had victimized her. Some justice, rather, for the people who had victimized her. Not completely, but her loathing for Epstein and Maxwell and their downfall did give her some comfort. Of that, I'm in no doubt whatsoever. At the end of the book, she reflects back on her time in Paris, testifying against Jean-Luc Brunel, who called her a liar and a prostitute. And as her story reaches a crescendo, we arrive at the point where she had sued Prince Andrew, and her father, Sky Roberts, the one she claimed had abused her, came storming out onto the media, terrain, saying Andrew was not above the law. I mean, so I even experienced so many emotions listening to this, so many. And then a witness came forward and recorded seeing Andrew and Virginia dancing together at Tramp nightclub. And but by this point, it was 2021. Her body was causing her innumerable problems. And what really, I think, started to really, really hurt her deeply was when it came to Maxwell's trial. She was excluded from testifying against Maxwell. She was absolutely gutted. The prosecutors didn't believe her enough to put her on the stand because she had been demonized, she'd been smeared, and she was not seen as a credible witness. It must have been hard after what she had been through not to be eventually heard in a place of justice. Nonetheless, she talks about taking great joy in hearing the verdict, which Robbie delivered to her excitedly in the early hours of the morning while she was asleep. But the truth is, and she maintains this, and she's absolutely right, Maxwell and Epstein did not act alone. They did not act alone, and nobody else has been prosecuted. On January the 12th, 2022, her claim against Prince Andrew was given the go-ahead. Prince Andrew, her lawyer said, cannot avoid this day in court, headlines screamed. But the Queen's Platinum Jubilee was coming up in the June. Andrew deleted his social media. And she, at this point, brings up the social media posts and the media appearances of Andrew's former girlfriend, the quite repugnant, reprehensible Lady Victoria Hervey. And Victoria has said some really egregious things about Victoria, because Victoria Hervey is absolutely desperate, A, to get Ghislaine released, and B, get Prince Andrew off the hook. She's an establishment piece of work. That's who Victoria Hervey is. And clearly she had very much hurt Virginia. And But the thing is that Virginia also is her own worst enemy at times. So she makes lots of sweeping generalizations. One of the sweeping generalizations she makes is that Andrew had hired internet trolls to smear her, but she gives no details. Now, that on its own made headlines this week, but there are absolutely no details. So it's too generalized for it to be evidenced. And then she recalls one of the highlights of her life when her legal representative rang her on the day that they were settling with Andrew and read out the statement. It was February the 15th. The settlement was announced. The details were secret. His mother, the Queen, was said to have footed the bill. It was rumored to be $12 million. It was so it didn't clash with her jubilee. And actually, as it goes, the end of the Queen's life as well. And Virginia agreed to a 1-year gag order so as not to tarnish his mother's jubilee. And the next day after the settlement, it was her eldest son's 16th birthday. The house was surrounded by paparazzis. And 3 days later, Jean-Luc Brunel, who she'd gone to France to testify against, was said to have hanged himself in the French jail. Of course, like Epstein, not for a second do I believe that this man hanged himself. And, you know, it's so hard to listen to all of this. Very, very hard indeed. And towards the end of the book, she's struggling. Really, you can feel her falling apart in real time. She is imagining that her children will be happier without her. And that if she takes her life, if she overdoses, then it will benefit everybody. And so she does attempt suicide. She's revived, and then she tries to take her life again. And as you can imagine, her family are absolutely struggling because it will be extremely hard for her children and her husband to be dealing with her. Of that, I'm in no doubt whatsoever. And I thought at some times, am I hearing this right? It's almost too much for one person to endure. And as we know, she eventually succeeded in taking her life. But at the end of the book, she is emotionally, mentally and physically struggling. Years of abuse and trauma have resulted in her body falling apart again. And around this time, she's diagnosed with fibromyalgia. She's so unwell, bless her. You can hear it in the writing. The trauma is just wearing her out. She's had some success. She's had a settlement with Maxwell. She's had a settlement with Prince Andrew. She's had some acknowledgement of what she's experienced, but her body can no longer handle anything, really. I feel terrible listening to it. I want to hug her. I regret feeling about her the way I did. But people are people, and I am no exception. And she really, you know, she talks again about Alan Dershowitz. She reads her statement about recognizing that they may have made a mistake. They both had a lawsuit against each other. And, you know, she has a gagging clause with him as well. And that's really key. It's so key. Much of what should be public is not, because it's been subject to settlement and being hidden from public view. And so that is always a problem with settlement, and certainly of a matter of such huge public interest as this. But again, I'm not in a position to start criticizing survivors of abuse for accepting a settlement. The final chapter is the title of the book, Nobody's Girl. And she talks about how sexual trafficking should not be a secret. That's part of why she has written this book. She refers to her collaborator, something that she barely does throughout the book. And she says, only by speaking out can we move others to act. I don't know when this book was completed. It doesn't tell us that. We don't hear about Virginia being given a restraining order this year that prevented contact between her children and her husband. It doesn't mention the accusations of being beaten black and blue by her husband, Robbie. She portrays him as a romantic knight in shining armor, not as the domestic abuser she accused him of being, or that he had once had a conviction for. It doesn't mention her social media posts of looking like this, and it doesn't mention any of that. It doesn't mention that she said she only had 4 days to live, and she says she wants to be part of spreading bigger messages. She wants to question a culture that tells girls the younger they are, the better they are. She said that's an absolute problem. Society is a mess. People look away. She wants them not to look away. She wants them to look. But it's more than that, really, she says. We need to look at what and why people enable this. And she's absolutely right. She said, we know about the monsters, the predators, but what about all the people involved in the operation? And I could not agree more. There are people who are absolutely culpable still walking around. This was industrial scale abuse. And in the last chapter, Virginia has kind of like come full circle in terms of Disney. And her daughter Ellie has a favorite song called I'm Mad at Disney. And Virginia realizes that Cinderella is about a story about a girl with issues. And she's so sick and tired of girls being pressured to be good. She's so sick and tired of it. She doesn't want to spread that message. And I don't either, right? Because us constantly telling girls to be nice is also what leads to abuse. So that is not a message that I've ever conveyed to my daughter, not at all. And she says we need to be brave about naming our abusers, but we must protect ourselves. And she said that's why she hasn't named names in the book. And it's not just about her. She says that there are people she's scared of identifying for fear for her family. Now, that is a legitimate fear in the circles that she was moving in. And she's still so bound up in so many respects. Well, she's writing this apparently tell-all book. But again, by the end of the book, she's gone through it all and she's reached the point where she's a worry again, but she needs to protect her family. By the end of the book, her and her mum are talking once again on FaceTime, and mum is believing what her dad had done to her. And she said, my goal, and I think this line is really telling. She said, my goal now is to prevent the emotional time bomb inside of me from ever detonating again. She sounds absolutely exhausted. She won't explicitly say what, but she admits she's a problem herself. She says she needs to rest. And then when the world wouldn't let her, as we saw, she took it anyway. You know, she refers to a play. She says these women had to parade their pain to get people to listen. For 14 years, since 2011, I've been parading my pain, the endless bloody talking about it. I don't regret it. And she seeks to free herself from the past with her book. She's tired of going over it again and again and again. And I can also see that writing the book would have been very cathartic for her. And then she says, in recent months, Robbie and I have found a healthier way to live together. She's glossing over again. And like her childhood, she's hoping for the best outcome, though unbeknownst to the world, they were experiencing significant domestic violence issues. At the end, her sons are 18 and 17 and doing well. Her daughter is the most badass teenage girl, as she describes her. She's planning to be a paramedic, she says, or a paleontologist. It is inconceivable what it must have been like for Virginia to be forbidden to see her children in the last days of her life. And it just feels so wrong. She talks of herself as someone who was able to recover and get past her childhood pain. And she says that really the aim of the book is if it helps one person, then she will achieve her goal. Before the book went to press, by the way, the two brothers and wives came forward to the co-writer, and they were deeply concerned that the book underplayed the domestic abuse that she had suffered throughout her marriage. And so am I. So what at the end of it all? It's a harrowing story, obviously, extremely harrowing. Some of it resonates at such a high level of truth that you know it, that it touches you. I found myself weeping on and off throughout it. I feel teary now. It's, hard going. And it is hard. It's painful to listen. It's painful to read. It flows easy, but how much of this story is Virginia's voice? Some of it, as I say, reads like a fictional account. How much did her co-writer write? We know so very little about these things. Some of the details feel more theatrical and even fictional than real. But what is she really telling us that is groundbreaking? That said, what we have, and I'm in no doubt about this, is an illuminating perspective of a story that has not only grabbed many headlines, but has historic significance. What anyone may think of Virginia, of Epstein, of Maxwell, of any of these people really, or Prince Andrew, I consider this book to be of significance with repercussions for law and order, for the art world, for finance, for politics, for royalty, and more. This book captures absolutely the despair of a woman abused throughout her life and finally taking control at the end when it all became too much for her. No one knows what she felt like when she decided to end her life, but I am certainly left with the feeling that for all her warrior spirit, true justice actually evaded her in the end. And I just really want to say at this point, rest in peace, Virginia Lee. You came, you left your mark, and then you departed. And it took it out of me. The whole thing definitely took it out of me. This is not necessarily something I would like to do on a regular basis because it triggers me too much. And I'm sure it will have triggered some of my viewers, but I do consider it important. I really do consider it so important to have covered this today. And I thank you so much for your comments. Thank you, Merv. Thank you, Reba. Yes. And I don't get. So is Andrew being charged on the basis of claims being made in her book? Surely it will be easy to defend in court without substantial evidence. No, that is not what they are potentially charging Andrew about. What they are potentially charging Andrew about is, and yes, so the repercussions are immense, right? So what they're potentially charging Andrew about, and I actually have it here. Let's just have a look at this. Because I noted that a lot of people aren't sharing this information. I think this is important. These are emails. I don't know if you can see them on this screen. And I apologize if you can't, but you should get the gist of it. But these are emails that Andrew is potentially being charged about. Because in this, it becomes apparent he's having conversations with Ed Perkins, who is his mum who's then alive, her deputy press secretary, Ed Perkins. So he's emailing Ed Perkins and Epstein is emailing Andrew, and they are all deciding how they're going to smear Virginia. These emails came out after the first image of her and Andrew was published in I think it was Mail on Sunday. It was Daily Mail. It was certainly the Mail group. And so that's what he's potentially being charged about, because Andrew asked a close protection officer of the Metropolitan Police that is being financed by the public to dig up some dirt on Virginia. So that is potentially quite serious interference. It's a nightmare, Sean. And Dell said, you never get over it. I am 70 and I wasn't 10 years old. What's that? You're welcome, Shin. And Marcus and I did it so you don't have to. Absolutely. Absolutely. You were 10 years old when you were abused, Del. I get it. I really get it. Listen, thank you for being here today. Thank you for going through this with me. I really appreciate it. I will be back on Monday as normal, our news show. This stuff is heavy, of course, absolutely heavy, but I'm going to leave you with this because I think this is when Virginia was really starting to come into her own. She had got together with a group of survivors, and this was when the world's press were finally prepared to listen to her and were not taking messages from the royal family to dump interviews. So thank you. Thank you for being here, and rest in peace, Virginia Lee Roberts Giuffre. Lots of love to you all. I'll see you Monday. Take care, people. Oh, and before I go, quickly before I go, thank you so much, as ever, for my super chats to Swiss Miss, to Catherine, and to Fred, and to Danielle. Really appreciate it. I always appreciate it. You people are incredibly amazing. And actually, this is also my patrons. So thank you so much. I do appreciate it. And I'm just going to leave that rolling up on the screen so you can see it, see who makes Wake Up possible. And there you go. Yeah, do you know what? I feel a bit numb and a bit weird going through all of that now, but it is what it is. So I wish you lots of love. Take good care of yourself. And as said, I will see you on Monday when we already have some very interesting guests lined up, and you shouldn't expect anything less from me. Thank you, people. Lots of love to you. Have a great weekend. Take care.